Episode 189, A Washed-Out Recovery. Jake was pointing the gun towards Mrs. Cox. There was pure rage in his eyes. "Jake, you could kill her like that!" People around him panicked. Two men tried to stop him, but he was so determined that they failed. He had completely lost his mind. He freed himself out of their grips. Standing with the gun in front of her, he asked Mrs. Cox to kneel down. His eyes bloodshot. He was eventually overpowered by 4 strong men. Suddenly, they heard a man moaning, which sounded out of place. One of the bodyguards walked up and muttered with a slight embarrassment. "Boss, there's this guy, and he seems to be drugged. Look." Mrs. Cox on her knees heard it, and suddenly laughed coldly. Everyone turned around to look at her. She grinned with her teeth colored red by blood. Her voice cruel, she screamed like a demon. "I initially just wanted to entertain your wife, but despite me telling you to come alone, you brought so many people with you. That's why I had to get rid of her. You're the one who killed your wife." Jake bristled, which oddly brought him to calm down. His eyes were as cold as frost, making Mrs. Cox shudder. "Since that's the case, why don't you keep the entertainment for yourself, then?" Jake's cold voice made Mrs. Cox become pale. "Take the two inside the car, so they can keep each other company." 2 people took Mrs. Cox to one of the cars. She suddenly realized that Jake was not joking. No way! Jake, you will get bad karma! You will be stricken by a lightning bolt and die miserably!" Before she could finish, she was stuffed into a car, and Monkey was pushed inside at the same time. They were driven away from the location. Her hands tied, Serena did not know whether she had woken up at some point. Feeling suffocated, she was reminded of something as water filled her lungs. It took Charlie Wrong a lot of effort to catch her in the water. Using all his strength, he started to swim while pulling her. Fortunately, there were staircases underwater near them. Otherwise, even he did not know how long he could do this. Because of the cold weather, Serena was wearing a lot. A down jacket that became heavy when drenched, a thick sweater, and a long dress underneath. Noticing the unnecessary weight that was keeping her down, he smiled bitterly. Putting one hand on top of the other, he pressed on her chest. After he did it for a couple of times, she spat out some water. Slightly cautious, she tried hard to open her eyes, but she eventually failed because of the pain on the back of her head. Seeing that, Charlie Wrong let out a sigh of relief. He wanted to yank her up, but his injured arm prevented him from doing that. All his strength seemed to have left his body from that injury. His whole arm was swollen and stained red. He noticed that he was becoming weaker and dizzier. However, he could not give up. This girl that looked extremely like Camilla. Her features were delicate. Although she looked pale, she looked almost exactly the same as the young version of his wife, Camilla. Travis Green's daughter, they call her. His eyes red, he smiled out of self-mockery. After resting for a while, he helped Serena up and said with guilt, "Sorry, I have to do this." He looked away and took her drenched down coat off. She felt her coat was being taken off, but she could not fight it. Before her finger even touched the intruder, she lost her strength. "Don't touch me, please." Tears fell from her eyes, but she could not even struggle. Her sweater was taken off as well. Her heart trembled as if it had been stricken by a lightning bolt. "Don't," she managed to mumble. However, her voice was so small that Charlie could not hear her at all. Throwing the sweater away, he took off his own coat as well, which could slow him down. "Don't be scared. You will feel better soon." Hearing that, Serena felt even more desperate. Her body was then lifted up. No. Please don't. She blacked out. Charlie put her on his shoulder and thought she was being delirious from a fever. He got up and went ashore quickly. The wind was cold that night. He shuddered with every blow. Climbing up with great difficulty, he could feel his legs shaking. No, he could no longer do it. He put Serena down and stumbled to the roadside. He saw a van approaching towards them. Charlie brought them to the center of the street. Although he could hardly manage to stand straight, something made him go there and wave his arms. Seeing the van had stopped, Charlie felt relaxed. A middle-aged man walked out of the van. Seeing Charlie being feeble, he quickly put a hand on his arm. "Help! Someone's back there. Help her! I am a Major General of the Army. Major Charlie Wrong." "Sir, I found some clothes near the shore. It appears to be a man's and a woman's." Held down by a couple of soldiers, Jake could not move. Hearing that, he looked up and saw a white, long down jacket. "Let go of me!" he commanded. People around him looked at each other and released him. He walked up and took the drenched jacket. It really belonged to Serena. He put it on her himself this morning. At the same time, there was a man's coat. Seeing that coat, Jake felt familiar. He must have seen it somewhere. "Military identification?" Jake blinked and took the card over. The name Charlie Wrong caught his eye. "Him?" Serena was feeling very cold. She woke up hurting all over. There was a throbbing pain throughout her body. The back of her head, her limbs, her lower back, and even muscles. She also felt cold and hot at the same time. She whimpered in pain. Vaguely, she felt something cold was put on her forehead before she fell asleep again. When she opened her eyes, it was bright. She saw the electronic clock on the wall showing the time. 17:17. Someone was watching TV on the bed on the right. The nurse was putting a drip on the patient to her left. Seeing that Serena had woken up, the nurse felt her forehead. "You still have a fever, but it's good that you're awake." She was a bit dumbstruck. She moved around and felt a great pain. Then she knew she was burning up. "Do you want some water?" The nurse poured her a glass of hot water, helped her sit up and gave it to her. "How do you feel?" Serena raised her hand and felt her muscles sore. She muttered, "It hurts." "Your temperature is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course it hurts." The nurse laid her flat and said, "Luckily you're conscious now. The guy that came with you is not so lucky. He is still in the ICU." "The guy that came with me? Who is it?" "You don't know?" The nurse changed her drip and said, "A good man brought both of you over. I thought that guy must be your father or someone related to you. He is in his 40s, shot by a gun. He lost a lot of blood but still dragged you out of the water. Otherwise you would be dead right now." Serena immediately thought of the person and whispered, "Charlie Wrong." "Right, that's the name. We have already called his wife." The nurse finished up and said, "I will go get your medicine." "Thank you," she managed to say. Both the pain and the heat were torturing her. She unconsciously moved her legs. The pain between her legs reminded her of something. Feeling immense terror and despair, Serena flipped over and bit on her fist. She recalled everything that had happened to her. Mrs. Cox, the revenge, the man called Monkey and his attempt to force himself on her, the man who was ill with a life-threatening disease. Unable to remember all of the details, Fear gripped her. Had she also gotten that disease from that sick man? Was Mrs. Cox's plan successful? Is this how she's going to die? Serena closed her eyes and tears began to flow down her face. She was just 21 years old. She did not want to die. She wanted to give birth to Jake's kids. She wanted to celebrate Grandpa's birthday. And she wanted to live longer. The more she thought about it, the harder Serena cried. She cuddled up and shuddered. There was no cure for this disease, and she would die an ugly death. Serena was bombed by the sudden threat and did not know what to do. What should she do? Was there something she could do? She sobbed, biting on her fist. When the nurse came over and saw her, she was startled. "What happened? Does it hurt a lot?" "Take the pills." Serena shook her head. The nurse helped her up and got her some water. Holding a bunch of pills, she managed to swallow them, but started to retch in just 2 minutes.